Welcome to this interview. My name is Tom Reiner and I'm here with two scholars from the Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam. On my right is Kees Boersma and on my left is Nathan Clark. Kees and Nathan, welcome to this interview. Nathan, to start with you, could you tell me more about the development of this field of research?
Thanks, Tom. It's great to be here. Our work really builds on the back of, disaster science is a lot of things. There's different disciplines that have fed into this for years. And I think the work that Kees and I do mostly feeds on the back of sociology and some key figures in that, pioneers like Enrico Quarantelli, Russell Dines, guys that were really trying to understand how societies and individuals and communities act in crises and in disasters. And contrary to what was the belief at this time, this was around the 70s, this idea that perhaps communities panic, that there's chaos, that there can be some conflict, that there's looting. Sure, some of that type of thing does happen, but by and large, what they found was actually there's continuity and collaboration and mutual aid and social altruism in these different instances. And so that opened up a whole field of research really into inclusiveness in disaster management. So how can we involve societies, different actors, different stakeholders in that? And that's sort of built over the last decades and decades into what we now have as a sort of all of society approach, which we'll talk about a little more in this interview today. So that was the first big paradigm shift, I think. And the second one was really moving away from a response-oriented focus, so reactionary to disasters, to moving more into preparedness focus and focusing on risk reduction. So understanding really the underlying drivers of risk in different communities and addressing those, which could mitigate or reduce or even prevent crises or disasters from happening. So it has sort of evolved into a way of thinking and a phrase that there's no natural disasters, which I'm sure Kees can elaborate a bit more on. But so that's sort of the shift that we've seen over the past years.
Can you, Kees, elaborate on that?
Yeah, I can recall. So moving away from let's say the response phase, something terrible happened to a community, can be a flood, can be an earthquake, and then the response phase, that's in itself challenging enough. But more and more but also the field, the professional field, is interested in prevention and preparation. So if you know indeed that the society will respond to a disaster situation and that there is a huge potential also in how the community will respond, why not materialize that before a disaster strikes? So preparation and prevention becomes increasingly important in our field. And that means also understanding, let's say, the social fabric of a community, can be a part of a city, can be a neighborhood. Understanding the social fabric of that community is key to the disaster and crisis management nowadays. And what I can also add to that is partly that has to do with those insights coming from experiences of the practitioners, but also that the type of disasters over the years really also changed. From what we call sudden onset disasters, floods, earthquakes, they still are there. But we also see an ongoing situation of creeping or enduring crisis. So think about climate change. So climate change, as we speak, is here, but the consequences of the climate change can be extreme weather.
Could you say that we live in one big crisis?
Some scholars and also policymakers use the word of perma and polycrisis. So polycrisis then refers to the idea that there are multiple causes to the disaster, or multi-hazards. So with cascading effects. So the one hazard causing a disaster like a flood is already serious enough. But what if a flood strikes in a city with a lot of poverty or bad protection? So that has a cascading effect. And permacrisis is the feeling that there is a sort of an ongoing situation of unrest. Mm-hmm. And that's not necessarily only referring to the physical dimension of disasters, but also to the feelings of uncertainty.
think we talk about this later and we go in depth. But Kees, I was wondering, I can imagine your interest must have started somewhere. Can you point to a specific moment of experience that triggered that?
There were two serious incidents in the Netherlands. One was an explosion in a fireworks in Enschede. It's well known in the Dutch context. And the second one was a fire in a restaurant pub dancing in Volendam.
Yeah, to be clear, the fireworks disaster happened in May 2000 and the other in also 1990?
December. There was December, New Year's Eve of 2000. Those moments. Yeah. And they were quite decisive for disaster management in the Netherlands because the evaluation of the responses to those disasters, they brought about, well, issues that could be improved by the interaction between the response organizations. Think about fire service, ambulance service, police, Red Cross. They started to invest in the collaboration. Because instead of working in silos and responding to the crisis, then they could talk to each other. And that is a development in the Netherlands that I contribute a lot to in working together with the professionals in the field.
So your starting point lies in the context of the Netherlands. Nathan, how is that for you? Ask you the same question. What triggered you?
The Haiti earthquake of 2010 happened. And that was really an interesting moment for at least people working with technology and with a really technical background, because it was the first time we saw on such a large scale a set of new actors coming into the picture. So private companies, technology solution providers, and groups of digital volunteers, or what later would be called digital humanitarians. They entered the scene, and you saw suddenly the application of drones for the first time, or at least at this scale, of crowdsourcing. So really of using applications, social media technology to crowdsource information and resources from both within Haiti, but also outside, to the diaspora of Haitian communities, coordinating information about relatives that had been trapped under rebel or needed assistance, to emergency management crews that were local. So this was a really unique instance, and that moved in then to the next major incidents, such as Typhoon Haiyan. We saw similar things, and that really triggered a moment for me where I understood that there was a space to move some of my more technical background and also the legal sides of things into this space. And so yeah, ever since then I've been trying to move in that direction. Yeah.
So and what did it to you personally, this disaster in Haiti?
Well, I mean, I guess it was, I mean, I don't know how much you know about that disaster itself, but I mean, extremely damaging, hundreds of thousands of people affected and lost their lives, and I think the whole world saw that, and then I don't know, it resonated somehow. In fact, years later, while I was doing my PhD, I went to Haiti to work on the recovery efforts for Hurricane Matthew, and it's a unique island for emergency response and recovery, because it has a lot of other underlying issues that, as I mentioned in the beginning, feed into their risk profile. So both socioeconomic issues, political issues, institutional issues. So yeah, it's a very interesting case to work on for disaster management. Yeah.
This talk, we are focusing on local initiatives when it comes to disaster research, science, so to say. You both are working on that, and it's also important when it comes to the aftermath of disasters. You both found that civil society is very important. Why is that, Kees?
Yeah, for various reasons. So the local context and understanding the local context is key for scholars working in disaster management, disaster governance studies, and of course also for the practitioners and policymakers. And the reason is, however global the reason for a disaster can be, it always strikes locally. At the local level, people suffer, people can lose their loved ones, their property, their housing. And so what Nathan is referring to when he went to Haiti, I saw that in 2015, shortly after the earthquakes happened there in Nepal. I went to Nepal, talked to people, and people really experience the disaster at the local level. So again, understanding the local dynamic is very important. So there's a saying among the fire service that your next door neighbor is your first responder, right? So that proximity to a disaster of the community of citizens is really also something that becomes tangible when there is a disaster and a response to a disaster. And from experience and empirical research, and there's a lot of evidence that local communities are not passive victims. So inhabitants that experience a disaster, there's sometimes the saying that it all turns into chaos and that people walk around and don't have an understanding what to do. To the contrary, people are then in those situations, in dire circumstances, take their fate in their own hands, and they started to work together. Sometimes in a really unexpected, smooth way of coordinating spontaneously. So in our study, we also pay a lot of attention to spontaneous volunteers that come to the disaster scene, sometimes cleaning up the rubble, sometimes helping others, but in different ways. So that is really fascinating to see.
This local resilience or local initiative, was it for a long time underestimated in a way?
I think so, yeah. I mean, as I said, going back into the 70s, it was this idea that chaos would ensue essentially in a crisis. But I think over the last few decades, it's been quite well researched that in fact that's not the case.
You both coined the term all of society approach with a focus on the vulnerable people. This is also a matter of high importance when you deal with a disaster, right? Could you tell us more about this?
It feeds into the same discussion. Maybe the first thing about recognizing vulnerability is understanding diversity in some sense, right? So understanding that it's not one thing. So we've worked with colleagues in the emergency services, but when you've asked how will you deal with certain vulnerable parts of the population should this scenario unfold, they'll give the answer, well, everyone's vulnerable. So we'll do the same thing we do when we need to evacuate or whatever it is. But that's not the case, right? Society is heterogeneous and there are different groups and there's different needs. And so the first step is recognizing that within a community that you have really different types of individuals that have different needs, but also different capacities and capabilities. So the second part is being able to understand how you can leverage that diversity. So using that skills and knowledge, for example, of local migrant communities or informal leaders or whatever it is to strengthen the overall societal resilience, right? By bringing them into the process of both preparedness and
yeah, I always say that everything that is not vulnerable, or every person that is not vulnerable in that period of time is potentially an asset, right? If you recognize the skills, if you recognize what we then call the resilience of those people, that can be more than a helpful hand. So that is very important.
Then there is also, Nathan, the role of technology, AI and social media when it comes to local resilience. It's in a way, it's your focus of research.
I mean, I started with the satellite technology. That's essentially since the genesis of satellite, we've been using them for emergency management. And there's been a lot of evolution since then in terms of technological innovation. And particularly in the last years around social media, or the last decade and a half around social media and now AI. So when you talk about preparedness, where do we get most of our information right now? For better or worse, social media. And I mean, that's widely recognized. So now more formal or traditional actors are using those channels to both communicate risk information, to increase preparedness, risk awareness, and also response information, what to do and when. And then it can be used also for scraping information, from gathering information from the sites to give yourself better situational awareness in operations of where there could be damage or where people are in need, or for mobilizing people. And AI is coming into this picture to in some ways support some of that through, for example, native language processing. For example, it can identify misinformation, which is obviously one of the big risks working with this, or disinformation. It can identify and counter that. It can also mine information or scrape information for you, providing certain types of scenario information for situational awareness, and a number of other things. And it's being applied in other areas like deep learning, machine learning, for using, for example, satellite imagery to train models on how to map risks or damage to areas.
Warning.
Exactly, and early warning, so predictable analytics. It's feeding into forecasts, so aggregating historical data with demographic data and other types of data sources to really produce some sort of forecast of a potential event, and even triggering resources or should some sort of threshold be met for example, landslides or floods or hurricane
prior to the disaster.
Exactly. Yeah. So it's moving its way into the process. It's still in a bit of an infancy stage, but there's a caveat to it too, that it shouldn't be used just blindly. Technology and data, it misses things too. It can't capture always the complexity and layers of vulnerabilities that unfold as disasters unfold, as different periods and scales in the disaster temporal.
Yeah, it's never a goal in itself, but always a means to an end to improve, right? The crisis response. So we also look at the unintended consequences of those who are overlooked in AI, or there are biases in the algorithms of AI that can potentially also discriminate people vis-a-vis others. So that is something that is really important also to consider.
Yeah. I think we're coming to an end of this interview. And that also brings us to the key question. Why is this research so important?
Well, for various reasons, because what we bring in is really the community perspective to the crisis and disaster management and governance. We really work with local communities, with people living in hazardous prone environments, so that's really important that you put that on the agenda. Second, because of the changing landscape of the disasters themselves, the poly and the perma crisis, both for scholars, as for practitioners, as for policymakers, it's really good to reconsider, okay, are we still asking the right questions? So we are working in the same sort of what we call paradigm for quite some decades now, where we realize that, hey, the all of society approach is really important to involve all of the stakeholders. But are there questions that we ask about their assets, about their needs, about the way they exchange their information, given also the new technologies? Are they still the right questions?
Then the final question, it's a more personal one. How do you unlock your potential together?
I think if you're serious about civil engagement and you're serious about unlocking the potential of that type of engagement and preparedness and emergency response, there's some key things that you need to consider. So you have to consider knowledge development and co-creation, which is really across sectors, across different disciplines and sectors, so multidisciplinary research, but also across different actors, including private entities. I think collective learning across different types of stakeholders, and really a diversity of stakeholders. So back again to this all of society approach, so that you bring in local perspectives and expertise into decision-making processes. I think it also means thinking about meaningful technological integration, when, like we've said before, not just blindly putting technology in, but really thinking through it. Yeah. And maybe also the bigger thing is if these formal actors, decision makers are serious about civil engagement and about these type of processes, they have to ask themselves if their disaster doctrines and their structures are really still fit for purpose for doing that. And if they're not, then they should consider that it's worth looking at them again and revising them. And that's where I think also our work and our research fits in quite well as a sort of bridge between.
But then on the personal level, like.
Yeah. Well, we started off with our background in the social sciences and humanities. And we think that is really a needed perspective in the field of disaster studies in the first place. We are now working together with colleagues from the science department, with hydrologists, with experts in earth science and all that. And they started to realize, given the magnitude of the disasters and also again the perma and poly crisis perspective, that they also need to work with us as social scientists and humanities, and also that's true for the professionals in the field. Okay, they are trained in a specific way, but we started to work with them, and then they realized that you actually can also work together with local communities and start how they feel, how they think, and that's how we come into the equation, and we can make that concrete. And in October we will start a new project, and that is on nuclear emergencies. And that's a big European project with, I think, 20+ partners in different countries. And one of the reasons for that project is nuclear emergencies in Ukraine and the geopolitical situation, where that of course is an urgent matter, but also energy transition, where you see smaller nuclear energy units close to built close to the communities, which of course brings an additional risk. And we joined that consortium, a group of scholars and practitioners, as social sciences from the humanities, because they realize, hey, we have to understand the social fabric of those who are affected by the crisis potentially. And we need to understand their narrative. So that's the humanities coming in. So there is a much need. You're asking about unlocking the potential. We have that potential. And if you make the connection to those networks where that really is missing, that perspective, hey, then we have a lot to offer.
Kees and Nathan, thank you very much for this interview and good luck.
Okay,
Thanks.